This is Vermont Edition. I'm Michaela Lafrac. If you were to make a list of the most valuable companies founded in Vermont, you might write down names like Cabot Creamery, Ben & Jerry's, Casella Waste Systems. At the turn of the 20th century, that list would have obviously looked very different, and it definitely would have included the Vermont Marble Company. The Vermont Marble Company was founded in 1880 by Redfield Proctor, and it grew to become one of the largest producers of marble in the world. But now, of course, times have changed. Quarries have closed, and the museum in Proctor that honors marble's contributions to our region has shut down. What happened, and what is the future of its unique and very heavy collections? Well, here to discuss is Kevin Thornton. He's a historian and filmmaker in Brandon and a board member of the Vermont Marble Museum. Kevin, welcome.
Thank you.
We're also joined by Ben Doyle, president of the Preservation Trust of Vermont. Ben, welcome back to the program.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us.
And listeners, you can join the conversation as well. Did anyone in your family work in the marble industry? What did you hear about it from them? Give us a call at 800-639-2211 or send us an email to vermontedition@vermontpublic.org. Kevin, let's start with the history of marble in Vermont. When did this first become a commercial industry in the state?
Well, I think the first time it becomes more than local is with Redfield Proctor. And the 1880 is a good place to start. Proctor begins in the 1870s in Proctor, or what becomes Proctor. It's a part of Rutland at the time. And in 1880, he is asked to lead a conglomeration of marble companies, and over the next decade forms them into the Vermont Marble Company. That is it's the largest marble company in the world, and it's also he's the robber baron of marble in America by then.
The robber baron of marble. So he clearly made a fortune.
He did, yeah. He's makes a fortune. He turns Proctor into the marble wonder that it is, and he also becomes very politically powerful. He serves as governor. In 1878, he's elected. Two of his sons become governor, and one of his grandsons becomes governor as well. And Proctor also is a U.S. senator from Vermont, and he's the Secretary of War in the Benjamin Harrison administration. So he's a very influential figure.
And Ben, how can you see traces of Proctor in the physical structure of the town of Proctor that was named after him?
Yeah, if you haven't been to Proctor, you got to go. It's unbelievable. The sidewalks are made of marble. They have an incredibly beautiful marble bridge. The fire station's made of marble. The high school, the church. It's really it's an incredible place, and there's a lot of pride in that. At one time, 1,000 people worked at the Vermont Marble Company in Proctor, right? And so it just kind of radiates out a lot of the identity of the community.
And there were quarries in that area and also other parts of the state as well. Kevin, can you tell us a little bit more about the people who worked in those quarries and what kinds of jobs they had?
So the people who work in the quarries, there's a whole series of ethnic groups that come in beginning with the Irish in the 1850s. This is before the formation of the Vermont Marble Company. And then French Canadians, Italians, Poles, Russians, all sorts of Eastern Europeans, Hungarians. And you can see that reflected in the ethnicity of Rutland County to this day. And you can roughly divide them, I think, into two categories: quarry workers and skilled carvers. The skilled carvers tended to be Northern Italians, almost exclusively, and the quarry workers for all these other ethnic groups, particularly when they first arrive and they don't speak English. It's a really typical ethnic story of labor in America.
A typical ethnic story of labor in America. Why? Say a little bit more about that.
Because, for instance, if you look at Carnegie Steel, they do the same thing. They bring in all sorts of different ethnic groups, do it sequentially, and they, as they become more acclimatized to America, they they tend to be replaced in the worst jobs by another ethnic group. And so that's what happens with marble in Vermont. The Irish are beginning to be restive about their jobs by the 1860s, and then the French Canadians come in, and so forth and so on.
We received an email from a listener named Michael ahead of today's show. Michael says that they were trained as a stone carver in the 1970s at the Vermont Marble Company and worked in that trade for over half a century. Michael also served on the board of directors of the Vermont Marble Museum, and says that the collection there is of great historical value, illustrating as it does the industrial development of Vermont driven by the needs of the marble industry. With it came the railroads, the machine tool industry, and it facilitated interstate commerce. It attracted a diverse collection of immigrants, as you just said, Kevin, with their skill sets needed for its production, and they brought their cultural heritage to add to the existing social structure. The Marble Museum housed the physical legacy of those who labored to provide much of the monumental public architecture throughout our country. Now, before we get into the Marble Museum itself and its fate, Ben, and then Kevin, I'd love to hear a little bit more about where we can find this marble today. What other structures, either in Vermont or outside of this Proctor and Rutland region, use Vermont marble?
Yeah, it's really all over the world. And Kevin, jump in here, but everything from the Beinecke Library at Yale to the Lincoln Memorial, parts of the Supreme Court, the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, the gravestones at Arlington Cemetery, and the United Nations. All of those buildings have marble that was either came from the region or was fabricated at the marble company. And it's amazing when you travel the state or the country, you can just find these places that really have this Vermont connection that's really so special.
Yeah, in addition to those very important public buildings, especially around D.C., there are hundreds of banks and hotels and college buildings that were when marble was in fashion, especially in the 1920s and 30s. It was courthouses as well. A tremendous amount of marble used in the interiors of those buildings.
Yeah, I just echoing that, and really thinking about the kinds of places where marble was used. And I think really why the story of this place and of the museum and the collections is so powerful is because we're really talking about like the monuments to democracy, right? That really had this Vermont connection and the craft that went into them and the care that went into them. And, that's a really special legacy for our state and for the community.
I think now when people think marble now, the connection is usually to Italy. But yeah, do you find that often, Kevin, people don't know that marble was coming from the ground right where we live today?
No. Well, I live in Brandon, so we're
Yeah,
we're in the
people know
we're in the Marble Valley, so people know. And when you walk around in Rutland County, especially, you see, as Ben mentioned, marble sidewalks. My neighbor has a marble rubble foundation to his barn. It's all over the place. So people, I think, in our area know.
Yeah. Well, if you live in the Rutland County region and have that close connection to marble, maybe you live in a place with a marble sidewalk or some of this product of Vermont's earth is part of your life in a very direct way, give us a call. Tell us about it. 800-639-2211 is our number. You can also email Vermont Edition at vermontpublic.org. Well, let's talk a bit about this museum, which was originally the Vermont Marble Company's showroom. Is that right, Ben?
That's right. It's I would say actually the Marble Museum, it's an incredible place, but it's probably the quirkiest museum this side of the Museum of Everyday Life up in Glover. It's really interesting because it originated not as a museum, but as a showroom for, the banks that Kevin was speaking about. Executives used to come up from New York on the train, get off at the factory, go to the showroom, and pick out the kind of marble they wanted for their lobby. And over time, they started adding exhibits. They had lots of visitors. They added a gift shop and, tried to tell more of the story of the company and the different things you could do with marble. So, for example, you'll have an exhibit that everybody who's been there remembers, the Hall of the Presidents, right? That these marble busts of the, the presidents up to the first George Bush. And then, you'll also have something like the modern kitchen from 1990 with marble countertops that people can take a look at. And so it's really quite the place.
And it's a very large space, right? Like 10,000 square feet?
I think it's more like 35,000 square
Oh,
feet.
wow. Okay.
Yeah, and it's in a complex. I mean, it's actually in the factory complex, which is 400,000 square feet. So I'll admit, the first time I went there and I stood back, I was like, whoa, this is one of the biggest buildings I've ever seen. If you ever get a chance, go down to Sunderland Falls. There's a little park and you can see the whole complex. It's a series of conjoined buildings, and it's breathtaking.
Yeah. Kevin, what's most special to you about this complex?
I think the atmosphere, that it was a mill, and then superimposed on that is the showroom, and the showroom is very much an artifact of the 1930s. There's a display, for example, of fireplaces, and you can imagine Fred Astaire leaning against a couple of them. I also have a quirky personal preference for what I call yesterday's bathroom of tomorrow, that they always had a bathroom display in there, and we have a film from the 1930s where they have a model take a shower in a marble bathroom. It's very risque, and they continually updated them. I think the last one, the one that's still there, is probably from the 1970s or so. There's a big jacuzzi. So it's very much a showroom. It always was. The former gift shop was where they had gravestones. And when you know that, I think the place takes on this really special feeling, and that's what I think I loved about it the most.
Yeah. Is there any section of the museum where you could learn about how stone carvers worked?
Yeah.
And the tools of their trade?
Yeah. There's a section on quarries and quarry workers. There's some tools in there. There are pictures of quarries, many of which are now flooded. So that's very interesting too, I think.
Yeah. There's an entire room too, the slab room, that's really just different. What are they, Kevin? Like 6x8 slabs of marble from literally all over the world. They're
at least that big. Yeah.
Yeah. It's pretty remarkable.
Well, we got to find out what's going to happen to this collection after the museum closed its doors last fall, but we're going to save that till after our break. We're also getting some calls in, so we will share your voices as well. This is Vermont Edition. Stay with us. Welcome back to Vermont Edition. I'm Michaela Lafrac. If you're just joining us, we are discussing Vermont's marble industry and the closure of the Marble Museum in Proctor. Our guests are Ben Doyle, president of the Preservation Trust of Vermont, and Kevin Thornton, a museum board member and historian and filmmaker from Brandon. Let's go to the phones here. We have Gordon calling in from Bridgewater. Gordon, you're on the air. What are your thoughts on the conversation so far?
My family comes from Eastchester, New York, which is the lower end of the marble area. I'd like to have some information how Eastchester ties into the marble area in Vermont.
Thank you, Gordon. So your family is from Eastchester, New York. Is that connected, Kevin, in your mind?
I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with it. I don't even know where Eastchester is. So if it's near southern Vermont, the Marble Valley extends about as far as Bennington. But I'm sorry, I don't have any more information than that.
Gordon, can I ask before we let you go, was your family connected to the marble industry in a way? Did they talk to you about it when you were growing up?
Yes, they came from Ireland in the 1840s, and they worked in the marble industry.
Well, thank you for calling in. Sorry we don't have more information for you about that part of New York State, but so interesting to hear that your family was part of this wave of immigrants working in the marble industry in our region. Let's go next to Laurel in Jericho. Laurel, you're on the air. Go ahead. Hi, Laurel. Can you hear us?
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I am calling because I used to own a house in East Dorset that an architectural historian dated to pre-Revolutionary War. The main part of the house, the original, had a beautiful hand-laid blocks of Danby marble for its foundation.
Mhm.
My question is, how does that tie with what you're talking about as the time of really sort of the development of the marble industry?
There's a simple answer to that, and that has to do with the weight of marble. So people are quarrying marble as early as when your house was built in the late 18th century, but they can't move it very far. So East Dorset and Danby makes perfect sense. That the creation of a marble industry is a function of, as Michael mentioned, of the availability of railroads. And railroads don't arrive in Vermont until about 1850, and Redfield Proctor doesn't put two and two together and realize that if you can quarry marble, you can finish marble, you can ship marble from the same place, then you can make money. So marble doesn't become a true industry in the 19th and 20th century industrial sense until all of these other factors come together. But it's been quarried, and you can find gravestones that are very old as well. So your house is an early example of a commercial use of marble, but it's I wouldn't call it an industrial use of marble in the sense that Redfield Proctor created, because the technologies weren't available then.
Mm. Ben, when did the Preservation Trust of Vermont, get involved in the Marble Museum?
Yeah, it's honestly a wild story. But
Do tell.
basically, in 2012, the kind of final owners who were operating out of there decided that they needed to close the museum and were going to sell off the different collections, at auctions, potentially for private collectors. And at the time, the Preservation Trust really, our mission as an organization is to help build communities through the preservation of historic buildings, villages, and downtowns. And, this is, as you've heard, just an enormously important part of our state and nation's history. And so the Preservation Trust said, we can't let these collections be scattered to the wind. We need to try and preserve them.
I like the idea of marble scattering in the wind.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, well, they don't. I wish sometimes they're, but no, really, it's. It was just this, we really led this effort and went through a lot of support, through people who really recognized how important this was. We're able to purchase a large portion of the collections. Some went to the University of Pennsylvania, but most stayed there in the museum. And then, one thing actually led to another, and we ended up owning the building. And, for really a solid 10 years, worked with board of directors and different community partners to try and make this museum sustainable and to continue to tell the story in the way that it's been told, for decades and generations. And, really, especially coming out of the pandemic, it just became clear, with different travel patterns, the dynamics in Proctor themselves in terms of the local economy, the regional economy of, the way in which people experience history and museums is always kind of changing. And so it really became kind of clear ultimately, after really giving it a try, that the museum wasn't going to be able to be sustainable given the business model. And so, we actually have since transitioned the building to new ownership that's looking at different potential uses for the building. And the collections now, it's not like we're back where we started in 2012. It's, we've stewarded these collections well. And now we're going to be very intentional about thinking, how do we use these pieces of stone, these exhibits to really tell the story of, as Kevin is such a gifted storyteller, of telling the story of the people who worked here and the story of place. And I, frankly, am kind of excited to think about what that looks like. Maybe it's a museum without walls, right? Maybe there's digital storytelling or different ways in which to display these collections, to utilize them, but most importantly, to steward them well, so that they're accessible to the public.
And on that note, just to close the loop on the Vermont Marble Company too, what happened to it? Because this museum was part of the company itself, and there's kind of a gap in time that we didn't cover there.
Yeah, so the company, I'm going to forget the year now, but the company is family-owned and controlled well through the 20th century. And then the economics of marble changes after World War II. All these bank lobbies and so forth we've been talking about go out of fashion. And the monumental business begins to erode as well. And the old model of using skilled carvers, Michael was one of them, he's the last of that breed, becomes less and less profitable. And so I think it's 1970, the company is sold to an international conglomerate that uses the resources of the company very differently. They're not in the architectural trade. They don't want to create a Supreme Court building, that sort of thing. And that Proctor essentially begins to change over the course of the 1970s and 1980s. They close the architectural practices. They lay off the workers who did the carving, and it becomes a very different type of operation.
And then a little bit later,
in 2007, Omnia, which is the corporation that Kevin's referring to, consolidated in Ohio. There were some local folks that continued to operate out of the facility, but yeah, it was kind of a gradual shift and decline of the industry in Vermont.
Michael, the board member of the museum, whose email I read a bit earlier, had something else to say on this topic I want to read now. They write, I believe that the preservation of this historic record is fundamental to the understanding of the identity of Vermont today. How this collection is to be housed, curated, and financed is the current challenge. I think it would be in the interest of the state, the business community, and local citizens to preserve it by whatever means necessary. This can begin with a conversation among these stakeholders, bringing their experience and creative thinking to the table. If we have the commitment, Michael concludes, we can find the solution. Ben, what are some of the biggest challenges of figuring out what to do with this unique collection? I mean, you mentioned like the bus of the presidents, for example. Yeah. Dozens of, are they life-size busts?
They're probably 4 feet tall. They're heavy.
They're heavy.
They're heavy.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
What are the challenges? I figure out what to do with those.
Well, Ben just mentioned the first one. Everything's heavy.
Yeah.
Everything's heavy. Yeah. I think what the trust is really committed to is making sure that we have people that can take care of these things well. Moving them, yes, that's a logistical challenge, but that's not my concern.
Right.
My concern is lots of people love these things, and how do we make sure that they're taken care of? And we're actually lucky in that, we've engaging the services of a museum consultant to help us really think about those things, right? About what are the ways in which, there are different parts of the collections too, right? There's glass plate negatives related to documentation of the work that was done there. There's, again, these stone things. And so just thinking about the different aspects of who in Vermont and who in Rutland County, who in Vermont, who nationally is best suited to make use of these things so that they can tell the story. And, I think we're really committed to doing a thoughtful approach on that. And, really hearing from folks who, want to raise their hand and say, we think we can do this, and we're committed to supporting them. We've been involved in this project now for 15 years, right? And we'll probably be involved for another 15. Mm-hmm. Actually, we'll be involved forever because we have an easement on the building to ensure that the historic defining features of that building are preserved. So, we're in it for the long haul and look forward to working with the partners that Michael referenced to try and find a best way to tell this story.
We're discussing Vermont's marble industry and the Vermont Marble Museum, which closed in the fall. We've Mason calling in from Putney. Mason, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Hey, you guys actually just brought me in at the perfect time.
Great.
You guys were just talking about who is the best fit to receive some of these pieces, and that would be Fletcher Proctor down here in Putney, where I live. He's actually the descendant of the Proctor family, and I was calling just to kind of bring that up as like a fun fact that the legacy does still live on in Vermont, and he actually pursued law in his career. He studied at Dartmouth, and now he serves on the select board down here in Putney. But he's a super important part of our community, and I was going to see if I could talk to him about the shutdown of the museum and see if he was going to be involved in the preservation of some of the pieces and if he has any plans for that going forward.
Oh, wow, Mason, thanks for calling in. Kevin, are you familiar with this branch of the Proctor family?
Well, Fletcher's a name that recurs in the Proctor family, and many of them went to Dartmouth, too. So that's part of the family tradition.
All right, well, maybe we'll find these pieces a new home via Vermont Edition. I'd love that. Thank you, Mason. We also have Winnie calling in from Irisburg. Winnie, go ahead.
Hi, this is really more of a story. My family heritage is Swedish, and my partner and I took a trip several years ago. We met two women, one of them whose in Sweden, one of them whose father was born in Sweden but immigrated to Proctor to work in the marble factories. And some years later, they actually came over, visited us. We went to the Marble Museum, and it was the highlight for them to see where their family heritage was. And we actually went to the library and found the marriage certificate and the birth of her father. So, there's a lot of tentacles of history. They're all over the country. So it's pretty interesting. So we really appreciate the work that you're doing and interested to hear what happens from here. And Ben, I think I know you, but you might not remember me.
Oh, it's nice to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Winnie. Kevin, I imagine that you hear stories like this quite often. Yes,
and Winnie, I'm so glad you mentioned the Swedes because I forgot to. Proctor had 2 Swedish churches in a town of about 2,500, 3,000 people. One was Swedish Lutherans, and another one was Congregational. So the Swedish community is very, very important in Proctor, and the Swedes were a big part of the marble industry. Redfield Proctor liked Swedes. He thought they were hard workers and sober, and they were Protestant, which was an advantage in his eyes. And so there's a big Swedish element in this story.
Mm. Well, thank you, Winnie, for calling in and sharing that connection across oceans with us. Let's talk a little bit more about the site of this museum and these facilities. Ben, you spoke about it a little bit earlier. You said that there's a company now that's trying to figure out what to do with them. What are some of the challenges and opportunities you see in this physical space?
Well, so what ended up happening is when we originally the Preservation Trust doesn't typically own property, right? Yeah. And so we stepped in this case because we felt like it was really urgent to try and step in, hold the property long enough until we could establish the museum on its own footing to be able to take over the building. When the museum decided that wasn't really possible, we actually put out like an RFP looking for kind of new partners. And what we ended up doing was transferring ownership of the building to a company called Zion Growers that are an industrial hemp processing facility. And so they're trying to break into this industry of using industrial hemps that can be used in things like building products or bedding. And, they've got a tough hill in front of them. It's an emerging industry and it takes an enormous amount of capital to invest in a building like this. But what I actually is really excited about is, in historic preservation, it's not about just keeping things the way that they are. It's about helping buildings and the places that have been a part of Vermont's history continue their relevance into the future. And what I loved about this idea was like using the natural resource-based economy in Vermont to generate new activity in a building that's frankly perfectly suited for it because it's enormous. And, they're looking for places to actually store bales of hemp. But, there's all kinds of opportunity. It's on a 27-acre site, and 400,000 square feet of industrial space. So there's plenty of opportunity to come up with creative things to do on the site.
All right. If anybody needs space, you call in. We got a hookup.
Yeah, for sure.
Kevin, what kind of help do you and other board members and folks who care about this space, this project, this history of marble in Vermont, what kind of help do you need in figuring out the future of these collections?
Well, I think Ben has hit on some of that. My particular probably favorite unfinished project is the glass plate negatives.
Tell us about that.
Well, the company had a vast collection had an official photographer and has a vast collection of glass plate negatives. Some of them you can find online through the University of Pennsylvania's website. Others are unpublished, and I think it's a wonderful resource, and to get those in the light of day would be a real achievement.
And to digitize them so that they can be available, online.
That's right. And Penn's, I don't think Penn's pictures are big and dense enough.
As you've thought about the future of this museum, Ben, have you connected, or you, Kevin, connected with other folks in our region who are involved in other museums of this type to try to share ideas? Have you learned anything from folks who have figured out a way forward?
I think week one when I took this job, I called all the museum friends I had and said, what do we do? And it's actually, it's really fascinating. It's a fascinating time in the museum world. This is another one of those per capita things, but Vermont has, per capita, the most historical societies and museums of any other state, right? And yet the way in which people experience museums is changing. And I think about when I grew up in the Northeast Kingdom and we were kids, right, we would go to Fairbanks Museum, and which is really one of like the gems of Vermont, but it was really envisioned as a cabinet of curiosities, right? And so when I go there, I'm like, oh no, they moved the bug art, like what's happening? But when my kids go there, they want to run wild and like grab onto things, and to the credit of a place like Fairbanks, they've recognized changing times and the ways in which people experience things, and they've put on this beautiful addition to their building that is much more kind of interactive and dynamic, changing exhibits. And that's, I think, really what it takes for museums to be successful today. And it takes a lot of leadership, a lot of capital. And I think, we have to recognize that with new storytelling techniques like digital media, that there might be other ways for people to experience history beyond just the walls of a museum.
Yeah, I'd like to give a special shout out to Scott McLaughlin at the Granite Museum.
Absolutely.
He was a consultant with us when we were trying to figure out ways to save the Marble Museum. He's done a heroic job.
That's in Barrie.
In Barrie, and he's so generous with his time and his expertise. And we even though we weren't able to save the Marble Museum, we're very, very grateful for his time and his help.
Well, thank you so much to both of you for telling us about the history and hopefully the future of the Vermont Marble Museum. Kevin Thornton is a museum board member and historian and filmmaker from Brandon. Kevin, thanks so much.
Thank you.
We're also joined by Ben Doyle, president of the Preservation Trust of Vermont. Ben, it's always good to have you on.
Yeah, thanks, Michaela. Good to see you.
Coming up, we are moving away from the cold, hard facts of history and getting philosophical. We'll get a preview of the annual Public Philosophy Week, where you can attend talks and participate in discussions about life's biggest questions, like maybe what to do with the collections of a marble museum. That's in just a minute on Vermont Edition. Stay with us. Welcome back to Vermont Edition. I'm Michaela Lefrak. Philosophical discussions don't have to be confined to college lecture halls. At least that's what our next guests are hoping. Every year, a group of local philosophy professors organize a series of discussions, talks, and screenings. The goal is to foster conversations about life's most meaningful questions. It's called Public Philosophy Week, and this year it runs from this Sunday, March 30th through April 5th. Here to tell us more is Brian Glennie, an associate professor of philosophy at Norwich University. His work focuses on the philosophy of the mind and urban arts. Brian, welcome.
Hey, thanks.
We're also joined by Tyler Doggett. He is the organizer of Public Philosophy Week and a philosophy professor at the University of Vermont, where he focuses on ethics. Tyler, welcome back to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Michaela. Great to talk to you.
So, Tyler, remind us, where did the idea for Public Philosophy Week come from?
We started in 2017, and it's based on an event that happens in Barcelona, Spain. But another big part of the inspiration was there were a lot of people in the state of Vermont who had an interest in and expertise about philosophy. And it was nice to be able to bring them together outside of classrooms, which are pretty inaccessible and forbidding spaces for some people.
And Brian, is this your first time giving a talk with Public Philosophy Week?
No. I try to do it every year.
Yeah.
It is a blast. You get to meet people from all walks of life, and they're smarter than me. That's what you learn quite quickly.
Okay, well, Brian, I just heard from our previous guest that there is actually a very easy transition between marble and the marble industry, which we were just discussing, and Public Philosophy Week. You are giving a talk about philosophy and skateboarding, and I hear that marble is actually an excellent surface upon which to skateboard.
Oh, yeah. I mean, skateboarders perform these tricks called grinds, and it turns out that marble is perfect for this. And one of our sacred sites. It closed down a little while ago. It was Love Park in Philadelphia, and that they actually used Vermont marble. And I just learned it's probably
Danby.
Danby, my gosh, yeah. This marble is so important to skateboarding that skateboarders took this marble and transported it to Malmö, Sweden, and reset up the Love Park with all the same dimensions and the same marble. I mean, so, was I the only one getting chills listening to this discussion of marble in Vermont?
And
maybe
we had
so,
a
maybe
connection
so.
about the Swedish immigrants who came here and worked on the marble. Wow. Oh, look at this. We're already is this the dream for Public Philosophy Week, Tyler, to make these kind of surprising connections?
You're fooling around, Mikhail, but this is exactly right. And that offer you made to those guys at the end of the program, if they want to do an event next year, just go to the website and send us a message. This sounds great.
So, Tyler, there must be some parameters on the kinds of conversations you have for Public Philosophy Week. Can you give us a little bit of a taste of what maybe like a possible through line is for all these types of discussions and talks and events that you put on is?
Sure. The conception of philosophy that we're using is really broad. So it's about any big picture question. So there are some limits. So if you wanted to do a session about how to make kimchi, that wouldn't work. But if you want to do a session about kimchi's role in a good life or kimchi's role in sustaining a culture and why culture matters, that would be perfect.
Okay. All right. So not necessarily a how-to, but a why.
But a why, yeah, exactly. Not a how, but a why or a what. And the topics that we have this year are pretty diverse. It'd be hard to really see a through line other than they're about really big questions like what the role is of interestingness in a good life, or children's liberation, or Brian's event about skateboarding, what to do with invasive species. They're diverse, but they're all or tied together by a conception of philosophy as asking these big questions.
Okay, yeah, Brian, let's talk about yours. It's called Skateboarders, Philosophers of the Street, and it's next Friday, April 4th in Burlington. Yeah. You're a skater and a graffiti artist yourself. When did you start to realize that these interests overlap with philosophy?
Well, it turns out skateboarders are often treated the same way as philosophers were treated back in ancient Greece. I don't know if you know the story of Socrates, not liked by the Athenian people because he made, I guess, too much noise, you might say, asked too many questions. And skateboarders are quite similar, not really liked by the cities, all the noise we make and, the trouble we cause to the citizens. And we have, hostile architecture keeping us out of some spaces. And then they say, oh, we'll build a skate park for you outside of the city where you can go and be. And so what I think is like the original philosophers were like philosophers of the streets. And that's exactly where skateboarders live.
And tell us about the skater's eye.
The skater's eye is related. The skateboarders have this unique ability, a tuned sense to see the skateability of urban architectures like handrails, stairs, ledges, of course. And we can look at the city and go like, oh my gosh, that is for play, even though it's built for, commerce or wayfinding or what have you. And so skateboarders appropriate these spaces for their own use. And, the city doesn't really want that to happen. They've built it for commercial purposes, not for play.
Is that what you meant by hostile architecture?
Yeah.
What's an example of that?
Yeah. I mean, if you just walk around Burlington, you can see these little metal knobs everywhere. Sometimes they actually cut out parts of ledges so that people can't skateboard on them. And, of course, I mean, just imagine if you loved tennis and somebody put sand in your court. I guess you can play on sand, but soft sand, we'll say. You'd be kind of miffed. You'd be like, what gives? And I think skateboarders have that same reaction. Like, hey, why can't we play here?
So your talk is going to be exploring these ideas. Again, it's going to be in Burlington. Tyler, you're going to be giving a talk with Vermont Public's own Erica Heilman in East Montpelier. What will you two be discussing?
Yeah, Eric and I are talking about quarter-life crises, midlife crises, and 3 quarter-life crises at Fox Bar in East Montpelier. And the idea for that came from I'm a middle-aged person, and I noticed that a lot of what my students who are approaching quarter life are going through is like somewhat similar to what middle-aged people are going through, and then talking to my parents who are farther along and seeing similarities there. So in these tumultuous times, Eric and I are just sitting down with people to talk about different sorts of crises we're experiencing.
I had a quarter life crisis, and it led me to journalism. So they can be positive.
It's a common but not like all that widely discussed phenomenon, I think.
Right. So, Tyler, you mentioned, again, quarter life crises, and I know you both work with students in colleges. Is your hope that these talks for Public Philosophy Week will center on young people and their voices, or are you trying to get people of all different ages and walks of life involved?
Oh, I think it's great if young people come. This year we have our first or second ever session that's being run by a middle schooler, and it's pitched partly at middle schoolers. But I love it when people of all ages and walks of life show up. I mean, the students that Brian and I teach at our universities have access to philosophy departments with like some ease, but lots of people don't. And one goal of public philosophy is to reach those people too.
Well, speaking of reaching people who you might otherwise not, Brian, I'm curious what it's like to both participate in the world of like graffiti and skating culture, and also study it in a place like Vermont that is largely rural. We don't have a huge city here, and trying to incorporate that culture into this place.
Oh, yeah. It's such a good question. Don't forget the hostile weather.
Yes.
So thankfully, there's been a strong...
You don't like skateboarding in mud season?
It's its own art. You could say its own skill, which I don't possess, sadly. Maybe if I had a midlife crisis right now, I could skate in mud. But there's, I think these hostile conditions bring together a closer community. We have 3 skate shops: Talent Skate Park and Skate Shop, and a couple others. And everybody kind of like gets along. There's a contest at Talent on Saturday, the day after my little talk on April 5th. And you're going to probably see hundreds of kids together, like experiencing this really unique activity, hanging out with each other. And then they'll probably like hang out that night at A-Dog, which is the waterfront skate park. And so, I guess you could say my most of my friends are they teenagers? Are they in their 20s? Because they're still active and about it. And boy, shout out to those kids. Maybe that's why I haven't maybe I am having a midlife crisis. Yeah. Tyler?
Yeah, that's what it sounds like, Brian.
All right, we'll have to diagnose that one off air. But Tyler, I have to ask you about another one of these sessions for Public Philosophy Week with quite the title. It's called "You Are What You Eat: Exploring the Ethics of Cannibalism." What can you tell us about this one that won't upset our stomachs and our minds too much?
Okay, so that's being done by 2 UVM philosophy students, Tomek and Rory. And they're going to talk about some ethical issues about consuming people. And to be clear, it's not about the ethics of killing people in order to eat them. It's about the ethics of just like ingesting human flesh. My experience teaching at UVM is this is a topic that students are somewhat interested in talking about, even if it's also pretty gross. And so I think some of the issues they'll talk about are similarities between humans, which we don't typically eat, and animals, which we do typically eat, but also some ideas about lab-grown human flesh versus lab-grown animal flesh. There won't be, it goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway. Like, of course, there won't be any tasting. It'll just be an intellectual discussion.
We're still going to get emails about this, no matter what you say.
Thanks
in advance for that.
Yeah, right.
You also have several events with former guests of Vermont Edition, including Lorraine Besser and Sheila Liming. What qualities make a good speaker for Public Philosophy Week?
So Sheila and Lorraine are both amazing. Sheila's doing an event about fascism, and Lorraine is doing an event about how sticks can make your life go better. That's going to be in Forest in Ripton, Vermont. Sheila's events in Burlington. I think the main thing that makes for a good Public Philosophy Week facilitator is being really passionate about their topic and also being curious and open-minded. Public Philosophy Week is open to anyone. If anyone out there in the listening area wants to present, I encourage them to send me a message or contact me through the website. In fact, one of the presenters this year, Kemi Fuentes-George, I first got in touch with through the show, Michaela.
Oh.
We were talking on the air a couple of years ago, and Kemi called in, and I invited him to do a talk, and so he's doing a session in Middlebury this year.
Oh, we love to hear it. Brian, what do you hope listeners take away from your talk?
Oh, man, good question. Well, maybe they could start skateboarding. No, I'm just joking. Or maybe I'm not joking. I think everybody finds themselves to be part of some kind of subculture, whether it's knitting blankets or, even working at food banks, being part of something, some small group initiative is very similar to what skateboarders have, and how you build community, how you tune your senses, how you initiate contact with other people to get them interested. And I think a lot of people, if they don't skate, they should come through. And, well, there's tacos.
Oh.
That's another thing.
Okay, you got to lead with the tacos.
Yeah, that's that Vivid Coffee, by the way. And I should have led with the tacos. But I think the idea is that we all want to be, craft people. We want to learn a specific set of skills and have a community. That's what skateboarding fosters. And you could come away after this discussion with like, hey, I'm going to apply some of these concepts to my community, make it richer, maybe more diverse, more meaningful.
I love that. Tyler, is that maybe what you're hoping folks get out of your talk as well?
Yeah, Brian, that was perfect. That was super.
Yeah. And Brian, Leslie, how have you seen Public Philosophy Week change over the years that you've been involved with it?
I mean, there's so many talks this year.
Yeah.
I mean, it's absolutely incredible. And there's a bicycle one I noticed. So we're branching out. Yeah, we're branching out into like know-how, other ways of knowing different things. So I'm absolutely thrilled to be part of this. And man, give it up. I mean, this is going to be could it be the best one ever?
Tyler?
I always think each year is going to be the best one, and I definitely think that this year.
Tyler Doggett is the organizer of Public Philosophy Week and a philosophy professor at the University of Vermont. Tyler, it's always a pleasure talking with you.
Thanks so much, Michaela. I really appreciate it.
And Brian Glennie, you might actually get me on a skateboard. Brian is an associate professor of philosophy at Norwich University. He will be giving a talk next Friday, April 4th in Burlington as part of Public Philosophy Week. Brian, thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right, that is all the time that we have for today. Tomorrow, it is the latest and last installment of our weekly series, Animal Hour. We've discussed beavers, big cats, sheep, and now it is all about bats. And for this show, we would love to hear about your latest bat encounter. Email us about it at vermontedition@vermontpublic.org and join us for Animal Hour tomorrow, Thursday at noon. Today's show was directed by Mary Angish. Our managing producer is John Ahrens, and our producers are Andrea Lorian and Daniela Fierro. Anna Berg is our intern, and they were also our call screener today. Our theme music was composed by Myra Flynn. I'm Michaela Lafrac. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll catch up again soon.